Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. How does an HOA claim your property when there's literally a road and drainage easement separating you from their subdivision? They sent violation letters like I was a member, demanded plans, and kept stacking fines. So I decided, fine, if I'm a member, I'm using member rights. Guess what happened when I showed up at their meeting? I never thought I'd end up in a fight with an HOA, mostly because I made damn sure I'd never live anywhere near one. Growing up, my grandfather had a small farm about 15 miles outside the city limits. Nothing fancy, just 20 acres of pasture land with an old barn that had been there since the late 1800s. When he passed, he left the property to my dad, and when my dad retired and moved closer to my sister in another state, he deeded it to me. The land had been in our family for 4 generations, and I wasn't about to let it go. The barn had seen better days. Years of weather and neglect had left it sagging on one side, with half the roof missing and most of the siding rotted through. But the bones were good. The foundation was solid stone, and I had the time and some savings to bring it back to life. I'd always been handy with woodworking and restoration, so this felt like the perfect project. My wife was on board too. She loved the idea of having a workshop space out there, away from the suburbs where we lived in a small rental house. The property sat at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by fields and woods. About a half-mile down that same road was a newer development called Meadowbrook Estates. They'd started building it about 10 years ago, and it had grown into one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions with identical houses, manicured lawns, and those little decorative mailboxes that all looked the same. I'd driven past it a few times and always felt grateful that my property was well outside their boundaries. I started the barn restoration in early spring. The first few weeks were spent just clearing out decades of junk, old hay bales, rusted farm equipment, and about 1,000,000 spider webs. Once I had it cleared, I could really see what I was working with. The main structure was a traditional post and beam design with hand-hewn timbers that were still incredibly solid. I spent my weekends replacing rotten boards, patching the roof, and reinforcing the loft. It was hard work, but satisfying. By summer, the barn was really coming together. I'd replaced most of the siding and was working on the roof when the first letter arrived. It came in the mail on a Tuesday afternoon. Official-looking envelope with a return address from Meadowbrook Estates HOA Management Company. I figured it was misdirected mail and almost tossed it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it up and found a formal letter stating that my unpermitted structure was in violation of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA covenants and that I needed to submit architectural plans for approval within 30 days or face fines. I read it twice, convinced there was some mistake. My property wasn't in Meadowbrook Estates. It wasn't even close to their boundary. I pulled out the survey documents I had from when my dad transferred the deed and confirmed what I already knew. My property line was several hundred feet from the nearest lot in their subdivision, with a county road and drainage easement serving as clear boundaries between us. There was no way I was part of their HOA. I called the management company the next day. The representative I spoke with seemed confused by my explanation and kept insisting their records showed my address within the development boundaries. I tried explaining that I had survey documents proving otherwise. She said I could submit my documentation for review and that until it was resolved I was still subject to the covenants. That didn't sit right with me, but I figured once they saw the actual property records, this would clear up fast. 2 weeks later I got another letter. This one was a formal notice of violation with a fine of $500 for failure to submit architectural plans and continuing work on an unpermitted structure. The letter threatened additional fines of $250 per week if I didn't comply immediately. Now I was getting pissed. I'd tried to handle this reasonably, but they weren't listening. I dug out my property deed, the survey map, and went to the county clerk's website to pull up the plat records. I downloaded everything and made copies of my survey documents. I sent the whole package via certified mail to the HOA management company with a letter explaining in very clear terms that my property was not part of their HOA and had never been part of their HOA. I included the legal description of my property, the survey showing the boundary lines, and highlighted the fact that my land had been continuously owned by my family since long before their subdivision even existed. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Another 2 weeks passed, and I got a third letter. This one was even more aggressive. It claimed I was now in violation of multiple covenants, including the original structural violation, plus new violations for unpermitted painting, installation of non-approved roofing materials, and failure to maintain approved landscaping standards. The total fines had somehow ballooned to $3,000, and they were threatening legal action if I didn't pay immediately. I couldn't believe what I was reading. They hadn't even acknowledged my documentation. They were just steamrolling forward like I hadn't sent them anything. I called the management company again and got transferred around to different people. Finally, someone told me their legal team had reviewed my submission and determined that my property was still within the HOA boundaries. When I asked for specifics about how they came to that conclusion, the person said they couldn't discuss the legal analysis, but that their determination was final. That's when I realized this wasn't just incompetence. I started asking around and found out that the HOA board was notorious for being overly aggressive. A few people who lived on the edges of Meadowbrook Estates had mentioned that the board liked to push their authority into areas that were technically outside their jurisdiction, hoping people would just comply rather than fight back. My property sat on prime land with road frontage and utilities nearby. A developer could easily subdivide it into a dozen high-end lots. I'd had offers before from companies wanting to buy it, but I'd turned them all down. Now it seemed like the HOA was trying to harass me into either abandoning the property or selling it by making it too expensive and frustrating to keep. I wasn't about to let that happen. I spent the next few days researching property law and HOA regulations. I learned that HOAs can only enforce covenants on properties that are explicitly included in their legal boundaries as defined in their original incorporation documents. I pulled up the original incorporation papers for Meadowbrook Estates from the county website and compared them carefully to my survey documents. Just as I'd known, my property was nowhere near their legal jurisdiction. The boundary of their HOA ended at the drainage easement, and my property started on the other side of the county road. There was no overlap, no ambiguity, nothing. But here's where things got interesting, and where I decided to get creative. I realized that if they insisted my property was part of their HOA, then they were also insisting I had all the rights and privileges of an HOA member, and their own covenants gave members certain rights, including the right to submit proposals, attend board meetings, vote on HOA matters, and access HOA common areas and amenities. Meadowbrook Estates had a nice clubhouse with a pool, tennis courts, and a small gym. According to their covenants, these were for the exclusive use of HOA members and their guests. If I was a member subject to their rules and fines, then I was also entitled to use their facilities. Before I did anything else, I needed some legal backup. I found an attorney who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. He was an older guy, probably in his 60s, with the kind of calm confidence that comes from handling this sort of thing 100 times before. I showed him all the documentation, the letters from the HOA, the survey maps, the deed, and the incorporation papers. He looked everything over and then smiled. He told me I had an absolutely bulletproof case and that the HOA didn't have a legal leg to stand on. But more than that, he said what they were doing could potentially be considered harassment and possibly even fraud since they were attempting to collect money under false pretenses. Then I told him my idea about exercising membership rights, and he actually laughed. He said it was risky but technically sound. If they insisted I was a member, then I could act like one. And the fastest way to make them admit their mistake would be to force them into a position where they either had to accept me as a full member or publicly acknowledge I'd never been part of the HOA. We came up with a plan. First, he'd draft a comprehensive architectural submission package that complied with every single requirement in their covenants. Not just for the barn, but for every aspect of my property. We'd submit it through their official process, which according to their bylaws required the Architectural Review Committee to respond within 45 days. While that was pending, I'd register to attend the next HOA board meeting as a member and submit a formal proposal for consideration. The proposal was simple. I wanted to add security lighting around my barn. According to their covenants, any exterior lighting had to be approved by the board. But here's the thing, the covenants also stated that the board had to consider all proposals from members and couldn't deny them without valid architectural or safety reasons. My proposal would be completely reasonable and meet all their standards, which would force them to either approve it or explain why they were denying a compliant request from a supposed member. We started with the architectural submission. My attorney helped me put together a package that was absurdly detailed. We included site plans, elevation drawings, material specifications, paint color samples, landscaping plans, and even drainage calculations. The barn restoration was already mostly done, so we documented everything that had been completed, but we also included plans for future improvements like the security lighting. a small storage shed, and some landscaping around the barn entrance. For the landscaping section, I had to get creative. Their covenants required at least 3 ornamental shrubs per 100 feet of street frontage. My property had about 400 feet of frontage on the county road, which meant I needed at least 12 shrubs. The covenants also specified that shrubs had to be from an approved list of species. I designed a landscaping plan that included exactly 12 shrubs, all from their approved list, positioned precisely along the property line. The kicker was that I placed them right at the boundary where my property met the county road, which would make it very obvious to anyone driving by that this planting was connected to the subdivision's requirements. The submission package was nearly 100 pages long when we finished. Every single requirement from their covenants was addressed in excruciating detail. We even included a section on historical preservation, noting that the barn was a pre-existing structure of significant historical value that predated their subdivision by over a century, and requesting a variance under the historical preservation provisions in their own covenants. We sent this package via certified mail to the HOA Architectural Review Committee, the management company, and each individual board member. According to their bylaws, the committee had to acknowledge receipt within 10 days and provide a decision within 45 days. While we waited for their response, I moved forward with the next phase. I registered to attend the upcoming HOA board meeting. Their bylaws stated that any member in good standing could attend board meetings and that there was a public comment period where members could address the board. I wasn't in good standing since I supposedly owed $3,000 in fines, but I figured they'd have to either let me in or admit I wasn't actually a member. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the clubhouse. I showed up 15 minutes early with a copy of my architectural submission, the covenants, and a notepad. There were about a dozen other people there, actual residents of Meadowbrook Estates, who were attending to discuss various community issues. When I walked in, I could see one of the board members recognize me. I'd never met him, but he clearly knew who I was. He immediately got up and went to talk to the president, an older woman who was sitting at a table up front reviewing papers. They had a whispered conversation, and then the president approached me. She asked if I was a resident. I said I was a property owner subject to the Meadowbrook Estates covenants, as their management company had repeatedly informed me. She said this meeting was for residents only. I pulled out the latest fine notice I'd received and pointed to the letterhead. I said that according to this official correspondence from her HOA, I was subject to their covenants and had been fined for violations. If I was subject to their rules, then I was a member. And if I was a member, I had the right to attend board meetings per their bylaws. She looked uncomfortable. She said they were still reviewing my documentation. I said that was fine, but until they officially informed me otherwise, I was operating under the assumption that their previous correspondence was correct and that I was indeed subject to their authority. Therefore, I was exercising my rights as a member. Another board member joined the conversation. He said I knew perfectly well I wasn't a resident. I said I wasn't claiming to be a resident of the subdivision, but that their management company had repeatedly insisted my property was within the HOA boundaries and subject to the covenants. If that was true, then I had member rights. If it wasn't true, then they needed to withdraw all the fines and violations immediately and put it in writing. They asked me to wait outside while they discussed it. I agreed. About 10 minutes later, the president came out and said they'd decided to postpone the meeting to a later date. Several of the actual residents who'd shown up started complaining, saying they'd made time to attend and wanted to address their issues. The president said something had come up that required executive session and they'd reschedule. People were not happy. I left, but the seed was planted. I'd caused them to cancel a meeting, and I'd done it in front of actual residents who were now wondering what was going on. A few days later, I got a call from the management company. It was someone new, a regional manager who introduced herself and said she wanted to apologize for the confusion. She claimed there had been a clerical error in their boundary records and that after reviewing the documentation I'd provided, they had determined my property was indeed not part of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. She said all fines and violations were being withdrawn and that I wouldn't receive any further communications. I told her I appreciated the acknowledgement, but that I wanted that in writing. I also pointed out that I'd submitted a comprehensive architectural package that was still pending review. She seemed caught off guard. She said that wouldn't be necessary since I wasn't part of the HOA. I said I understood that was their current position, but that I'd spent considerable time and money preparing that submission in response to their demands, and I expected a formal response from the Architectural Review Committee as their bylaws required. She said she'd look into it. I also mentioned that I'd registered to attend the board meeting and that I expected them to reschedule it soon since they'd canceled the previous one. She quickly said that wouldn't be necessary and that they'd be sending me formal correspondence confirming I wasn't part of the HOA. Then I played my final card. I said that since they'd now acknowledged I wasn't part of the HOA, I expected reimbursement for the attorney fees I'd incurred dealing with their error, as well as compensation for my time spent preparing documentation they'd demanded. She said she'd have to discuss that with the board. My attorney followed up with a formal letter. It laid out everything that had happened, documented the timeline of their false claims and harassment, and demanded reimbursement of attorney fees along with a formal written apology from the board president. The letter also noted that we were forwarding copies of all documentation to the state HOA Oversight Board for their review regarding possible violations of HOA management regulations. The state oversight angle was what really got their attention. HOA management companies are licensed, and complaints about fraudulent fee collection or harassment can result in investigations and penalties. The last thing they wanted was regulatory scrutiny. Within a week, I received a check for the full amount of my attorney fees, which had come to about $2,500. Along with it was a formal letter of apology signed by all 5 board members. The letter acknowledged that my property had never been part of the HOA, that the violations and fines had been issued in error, and that they apologized for any distress or inconvenience caused. But the real satisfaction came a few months later. My neighbor down the road mentioned that 2 board members had resigned from the HOA and they'd switched management companies. He said several homeowners had started asking questions after the canceled meeting and word had gotten around about what happened. People started wondering what else the board might have been doing wrong. The new management company apparently came in and did a full audit, and there were some issues with how the previous company had been handling funds and violations. I don't know if my situation was the only cause, but I'd like to think it played a part. The other property owners in the area, the ones who'd been getting similar pressure from the HOA, suddenly stopped hearing from them. The aggressive expansion tactics ceased. The HOA went back to just managing their own subdivision and left the rest of us alone. As for my architectural submission, I never did get an official response from the Architectural Review Committee. I guess once they admitted I wasn't in their jurisdiction, they just quietly filed it away and hoped I'd forget about it. I didn't need their approval anyway, but it would have been funny to see them try to formally review and approve plans for a property they just admitted they had no authority over. The barn restoration was finished by late fall. It looks great now, with fresh red siding, a new metal roof, and the old post and beam structure still standing strong underneath. My wife and I use it as a workshop and studio space, and we spend weekends out there working on projects and enjoying the quiet. I never did install the security lights I had proposed to the board. I did not actually need them, but I did plant the 12 ornamental shrubs from their approved species list, placed exactly where my landscaping plan said they would go. Every time I drive past them, I smile. A few months after the apology letter, I heard that 2 HOA board members had resigned and the management company had been replaced. Apparently, the canceled meeting made residents start asking questions, and once people started looking closer, my situation was not the only problem. The aggressive letters to nearby non-HOA properties stopped after that. Meadowbrook Estates went back to managing Meadowbrook Estates, which is exactly what they should have been doing from the start. The best part is that their own overreach backed them into the corner. They wanted to find me like a member, so I acted like a member. I submitted architectural plans, registered for a board meeting, and asked to exercise the rights their own bylaws would have given me if their claim had been true. Suddenly, they had only 2 choices. Treat me like a full HOA member with all the rights and privileges that came with it, or admit I had never been part of their HOA at all. They chose the second option. They withdrew the fines, apologized in writing, reimbursed my attorney fees, and finally left me alone. The property stays in the family, just like my grandfather intended. The deed is filed safely away, along with every HOA letter, every certified receipt, and the formal apology signed by the board. Sometimes I still see cars from Meadowbrook Estates slow down when they pass the barn. Maybe they are just admiring the restoration. Maybe they know it is the place that caused their HOA so much trouble. Either way, I do not care. The barn is mine. The land is mine. The shrubs are technically HOA approved, which still makes me laugh, and I sleep very well knowing that I am not and never have been part of any HOA, and I never will be. The next one is a malicious compliance story. This story of malicious compliance was shared with me by my grandfather many years ago, so some details may be a little fuzzy and I am not completely sure about all the official job titles. However, I will do my best to explain the main idea as I remember it. My grandpa used to work for the railroad as a signalman. His job was to ride at the back of the train and use a lantern to communicate signals to the train driver at the front. At that time, trains were much shorter than they are today. These days, safety regulations are written in blood, and most of them exist for very good reasons. According to my grandpa, though, back then a lot of safety protocols were still being developed. The people actually working on the trains often had a much better understanding of what was safe and effective than the people writing the rulebook. For a bit of extra context, the mechanism that connects train cars is called a coupling. The two parts come together, lock, and then the cars are solidly connected. To compare it to building with toy bricks, you do not just gently place one brick on top of another and expect it to connect. You have to press them together firmly enough to get that satisfying snap. Train couplings are similar, except instead of tiny plastic pieces measured in grams, you are dealing with metal carriages that weigh tons. So instead of a little snap, you need a proper bang. Now, on to the actual story. The train depot had recently hired a new manager. I am not sure if that was his official title, so I will just call him the manager. He decided very quickly that everything had to be done exactly by the book. Naturally, everyone came to hate him pretty quickly because the rulebook at the time seemed to have been written by someone more interested in creating arbitrary rules than making sure anything actually worked. One day, my grandpa grabbed his lanterns and got into the caboose at the end of a line of train cars. The engine backed up along the track to prepare for coupling, but before the driver could do it properly, the new manager came running out, yelling and waving his arms. The engine driver and the manager argued back and forth. Even from the back of the train, my grandpa said he could see the driver's exasperated sigh. That was when the malicious compliance began. The engine slowly backed along the track until the couplings came together in a gentle kiss. Or at least as gentle as two multi-ton pieces of metal can manage. The line of train cars did not even shudder. Then the engine driver pulled forward, leaving the cars behind. The couplings had touched, but there had been no bang to lock them together. My grandpa signaled that it had not worked. The engine stopped, then slowly and gently reversed again. Another kiss. No coupling. The driver pulled forward, backed up, and tried again. Kiss. No coupling. This went on for about 15 minutes before the engine driver and the manager got into another argument. My grandpa said he could guess what they were saying. The engine driver was probably saying something like, "This is not working and we are wasting time. We need to get back on schedule." The manager was probably saying, "No, keep following the book exactly, no deviation. The book says this will work, so follow the book until it does." So they kept going. Another 15 minutes passed. The engine pulled forward, backed up, gently touched the coupling, failed to connect, and tried again. By then, they had wasted 30 minutes and the train was officially behind schedule. Still, the manager insisted that they had to keep doing it by the book. Finally, someone higher up, possibly the depot master or station master, came along to find out why the engine was acting like the slowest pendulum in existence and why they had wasted half an hour. After getting the story from both the engine driver and the manager, the depot master finally told the manager to be quiet and let the people who actually worked on trains get the job done. The process had gone on long enough, and it was painfully obvious that the book was wrong. The manager crossed his arms and stood there fuming. The engine pulled forward a little farther than the rulebook allowed. The whistle blew its warning call. Then the engine reversed at a proper speed. Not full ramming speed, obviously, but fast enough to do the job correctly. Bang! The line of train cars shuddered gently. Then the engine pulled forward, and this time the cars came with it. They were finally coupled. My grandpa signaled that everything was good, and the train finally got underway. He did not get to hear the scolding that came afterward, but as the caboose passed the manager on its way out of the depot, he said the man looked like a little boy getting the lecture of his life. The next one is an entitled people story. So this happened when I was 14, and I'm 22 now, so a lot of this is going to be from memory. Don't expect a lot of dialogue. Now that I'm living on my own, I feel safe enough to share one of the more ludicrous stories from when I lived with my family, and it just so happens to be one of the times where she acted like a stereotypical Karen. Around this time, The Secret Life of Pets had been airing in theaters, and so my mom took my brother and I to see the movie in the local theater. In the main hall was a mini arcade with a handful of claw machines and a couple of those motorcycle racing games, but some of these took quarters and others took tokens, which is integral to the story. We went in to watch the movie and it was okay. My brother found it boring. He was 10 at the time. And I didn't find it that entertaining either. My mom seemed to agree and I thought that we could just go home and sleep, but no. She spotted the rubber duck claw machine. The holy grail for any rubber duck collectors. And no, she didn't own a Jeep, she just loved rubber ducks. She had over 100 of them at one point before I moved out. My brother asks if he could get a rubber duck too, and she turns to him and asks, "Do you have money?" He responds with a solemn no, and she says in turn, "Well, then you don't get any." I didn't even bother asking. I knew her games by now. If it didn't benefit her, she wouldn't do it. She'd even picked out the movie and framed it as something my brother would like, when it wasn't his type at all. So, I wasn't surprised when she snapped at him and he just fell silent. She approached the token machine to get tokens, and that's when I see the little sign that says that the machine does not take tokens, and only takes quarters. So, as the well-meaning daughter that I am who somehow still loved her mom, I try to speak up. "Hey, Mom, the machine doesn't take tokens." My mom ignores me, so I repeat myself, but then she snaps, "Shush, I'm getting tokens for the duck machine. You're not getting a ducking duck either." So, I let her do it, and watch as she buys $5 or $10 worth of tokens, don't remember which, only for the machine to, surprise, surprise, not take her tokens, and she loses it. She tries several times to shove the tokens into the quarter slot, but they obviously don't work. I tried to tell her that I had warned her that the machine only took quarters, and she lost it on me, saying that I was lying to her and that I hadn't said a word about it before telling me to shut up. Right, Mom? Good to know. So, what else does she do but march up to the customer service desk to whine about the consequences of her own actions? My brother and I were just trying to hide behind the cardboard cutouts and pretend that we didn't know this crazy lady as my mom yells and stomps her foot like a petulant child, demanding that she get a refund for the tokens she bought for a stupid broken machine. The poor customer service employee, an older teen who looked like she also wanted to be anywhere but there, repeats herself over and over, explaining that the tokens were non-refundable and that she couldn't give my mom a refund. We were too far away to hear all of it, so I wouldn't be able to say if the employee threatened to call the police or if my mom just gave up, but my mom eventually storms off and yells for us to follow her out to the car. Once we get in, she throws the token cup into the cup holder, grumbling about how she was now stuck with these useless tokens and how the employee was a useless, uptight idiot. Then she declared that we would never be going to that theater ever again because it was run by scammers who wanted to steal her money. And we never went to the theater as a family ever again. Truly, Mom, you're such a genius. Because it's the cinema's fault that you blatantly ignored multiple signs and verbal warnings in the pursuit of rubber ducks and ended up with tokens that you couldn't use because nobody can be right but you, even worse. She treated my little brother like crap because he had the audacity to ask if he could have a rubber duck too. Like, did she expect a 10-year-old boy to carry around his pocket change with him to the theater? Especially when that was our only plan for the night. It still makes me mad just thinking about it. That, among many reasons, is why I'm now no contact with her. My brother still lives with her, and I hope he can get out and be free from her influence as well. The next one is an entitled parent story. A little bit of context before I start. My first job, back when I was a freshman, was working as a program attendant at one of those city fairs. For this job, I was stationed in a small park-like field that had several tents, each with a different activity for kids to do with their families. On the day this incident happened, I was working at a tent where kids could decorate little toys and crafts like pinwheels, folding fans, paper masks, tote bags, and things like that. Everything was going smoothly until an uncle came in with his 3 nieces. They started coloring a tote bag, and at first everything seemed normal. Then the uncle asked me if there were any chargers nearby. I told him there were none that I knew of in my area, but that he could go to the guest services building, where they usually had all kinds of chargers, including Apple, Android, and USB chargers. Unfortunately, he said that was too far because his nieces were not done with the activity yet, so he asked if we at least had an outlet. The problem was that we were in a wide-open park, so there were no outlets in the activity area. I suggested that he check the building where the washrooms were. He did, but apparently there was nothing there either. By that point, he was starting to get desperate, so I finally suggested that he ask the people in the sound tent. Since they had all the equipment for the performers, there was a chance they might have an outlet of some kind. He told his nieces that he would be right back and headed over. The problem was that on the way, he tried to unplug one of the speakers the performers used. Luckily, I noticed and was able to stop him before he actually did it. Once he left, I continued helping his nieces with the activity. The sound tent was still within view, so I was not too worried at first. After a little while, the girls finished their activity, but their uncle still had not come back. That was when I started to get concerned. The oldest niece said she would go get him, then walked off while I moved on to help the next family. While I was helping the second family, I suddenly saw the niece come back, but when I looked up, she was not with her uncle. She was with one of the supervisors. I asked what had happened, and the supervisor said the niece had come up to her and sadly asked where her uncle was. That was when I got really concerned. The #1 rule in the youth zone was that kids had to be supervised at all times, and this guy had just walked off and disappeared. I asked the niece if she had any way to contact him. She said she did not have her uncle's phone number, but she could call her dad, and her dad could call him. At first, we were relieved, but then I pointed out the obvious problem. If he had left because he was looking for a charger, chances were his phone was already dead by then, so all we could really do was try to find him. The good news is that we eventually found him. The bad news is where we found him. After about an hour, he was discovered on the main stage where the children's performers were supposed to be. This was the stage used for magicians, costume characters, children's bands, and other performers. And yes, he was once again trying to unplug one of the speakers, just like he had tried to do at the smaller stage earlier. That brings us to rule number 2. Only 3 types of people were allowed on the main stage: performers, staff, and audience members who were specifically invited up by performers. When there were no performances happening, nobody was allowed on the stage at all. The supervisor went over to talk to him. I could not hear the conversation, but I could tell she was furious from all the hand motions she was making. When the uncle came back, he looked very sheepish and quickly told his nieces that it was time to leave. At first, this might sound more like a story about a careless caregiver than an entitled person, but the entitlement became clear after my shift when the supervisor told me her side of the conversation. Apparently, the uncle complained that there were not enough outlets. The supervisor was dumbfounded and basically said, "Where exactly are we supposed to put them? This is an empty field." She was also angry because the speakers were expensive, likely worth thousands of dollars, and he had not only gone into an off-limits area, but had also tried to mess with important performance equipment. So this guy broke multiple fair rules, abandoned the children he was supposed to be supervising, and nearly unplugged expensive equipment because he did not plan ahead. Then somehow he blamed us for not having enough outlets in the middle of a field. Anyway, thank you for watching.